بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه وبعد اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Let us begin with, we're going to go back, or we're going to restart after a little bit of a break, back to our explanation of Dalil al-Talib. And we have reached Bab al-Masah al-Khuffayn, or Masah al-Khuffayn, chapter on wiping over the khuffayn. The author, he says, يجوز بشروط سبعة لبسهما بعد كمال الطهارة بالماء وسترهما لمحل الفرض ولو بربطهما وإمكان المشي بهما عرفا وثبوتهما بنفسهما وإباحتهما وطهارة عينهما وعدم وصفهما البشرة. It is permissible under 7 conditions. Number 1, wearing them after purification with water. 2, that they must cover the area required for washing, even if secured by tying. Number 3, it must be feasible according to custom to walk in them. Number 4, they must remain affixed on their own. Number 5, they must be lawful. Number 6, their material must be pure. And number 7, they must not describe the skin underneath. So these are 7 conditions. These 7 conditions relate to the idea of the rukhsa. So we have in the hadith of Jarir, رأيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بال ثم توضأ ومسح على خفيه. I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam relieve himself and then go and make wudu and then wipe over his 2 khufs. This is recorded by al-Bukhari and Muslim, as well as Imam Ahmad in his Musnad. And this is a rukhsa. What is a rukhsa in the madhab? A rukhsa in the madhab, and perhaps the definition of Ibn Hamdan is most appropriate here. He says it is ثبوت حكم لحالة تقتضيه مخالفة مقتضى الدليل أو مقتضى دليل يعمها. The establishment of a ruling for a case that necessitates it, while contradicting the implication of general evidence that includes it. So what does this mean? The general evidence about wudu includes what? Washing the feet. Now we have another ruling with a specific case that says, in these cases, don't wash the feet. So the establishment of a ruling, i.e., wiping over the socks, for a case that necessitates it. This is the need that tells us that this is a dispensation or an allowance, while contradicting the implication of a general evidence that includes it, i.e., the verses of wudu. Well, how do we know then which one to follow? We understand that general evidences are applicable at all times, hatta, until they are specified, right? General evidences remain general until they have been specified. So we know that this is permissible. Why? Well, because we have evidence from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he did it. But is it anything that's on your feet that's permissible to wipe over? Or are there specific rules for this? Well, there are specific rules for it. And the author here mentions them that there are 7. The first of these is wearing them, meaning the 2 khufs, after purification with water. بعد كمال الطهارة. After, so if you make a ghusl, you're cleaning yourself with water, and you can wear your khufs afterwards and then wipe over them later. If you make wudu, you are purifying yourself with water, and therefore you may wipe over your khufs later. If you have made tayammum, you may not. Why? Because tayammum is the replacement for wudu and tahara. And masah al-khuffayn, wiping over the khufs, is replacement for the washing of the feet. So we would not have 2 replacements following each other. We know that this is a condition because of the hadith of al-Mughira radiyallahu anhu, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was traveling. He said, I was with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. كنت مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم على سفر فأهويت لأنزع خفيه فقال دعهما فإني أدخلتهما طاهرتين ثم أو فمسح عليهما. Leave them, because he said, I was traveling with the Prophet ﷺ, and I went down to unloosen his khufs, and he said, leave them, as I have entered my feet into them while pure. Then he wiped over them. This is narrated in Bukhari, Muslim, and the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. He then says, سترهما لمحل الفرض ولو بربطهما, that they cover the area required for washing. What is the area required for washing? From the above the ankle to the rest of the foot. So the khuf or the sock must cover the entirety of the foot up into, including the ankle. Okay. He then says, أي وسترهما لمحل الفرض ولو بربطهما, even if they have to be fastened. So for example, a person wears boots, okay, and you pull the boots up on the side through the boot straps, and you have to tie them up, or let's say for example you're wearing high tops or something that has to be fastened. The fact that you are fastening that footwear does not nullify the permissibility of being able to wipe over them. Why is this important? Because when he mentions later they must be affixed on their own, or you must be able to walk in them, right? Then some people might think, well, if there's any kind of ties that are related to it, then it's not permissible. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is if the nature of the footwear is that it has fasteners, those fasteners may be wiped over, and you may wipe over that footwear. Thirdly, وإمكان المشي بهما عرفا, it must be feasible according to custom to walk in them. So if your footwear, let's say, you put on some foot warmers that you can't really walk around in, you slip and you slide and you fall over, it's not permissible to walk over or to wipe over. If the footwear itself cannot be walked in, then you cannot wipe over it. Does this mean that you have to be able to walk on gravel and walk a mile in the road and walk a certain distance without it being ripped? No, that does not mean that whatsoever. What it means is that it has to be stable on the foot enough so that a person can walk in them. Otherwise, they defeat the purpose of being active footwear. They must be affixed on their own. وثبوتهما بنفسهما. قال في الشرح ولو بنعلين إلى خلعهما. Even if someone is wearing sandals, فيمسح عليها وعلى سيور النعلين. So even if, in order to affix that footwear, you wear sandals and the sandals have laces or straps that come up your leg, then that is permissible. Why do we know this? Because of the hadith of al-Mughira, also narrated by Imam Ahmad in his Musnad, as well as Abu Dawud and al-Tirmidhi, أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مسح على الجوربين والنعلين. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم wiped over the two jawrab, the two socks, and sandals. And I'm going to show you some pictures in a bit to give you some context about how these things looked. The fifth condition, وَإِبَاحَتُهُمَا, they must be lawful, this follows the principle of the madhab that you have to have permission to use them, right? They can't be stolen, they can't be usurped, they have to be yours, or you have to have permission to use them. that their material must be pure. طهارة عينهما. That means you have to have, excuse me, the material that it is made from must be made from things which are pure and permissible to use. So you cannot use, for example, pigskin. You cannot use alligator skin. But could you use leather? Yes. Could you use cotton? Yes. Could you use wool? Yes. In fact, it's narrated from Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu and others that he would wipe over wool socks. And we'll see, the more that we know about the ancient world and the reality, the closer it becomes, or the easier it becomes to understand that the permissibility of wiping over the two khufs was stated so because that was the normal footwear that they wore in the harsher environments when they traveled. Because generally you wanted to have a leather sock over your foot because your foot was going into a very harsh stirrup, and it needed not only to be protected from the cold, protected from the elements, but also protected from the other footwear or the other things that your feet were going into when you were riding a camel or a horse. But there's plenty of evidence that there are a number of different types of footwear which were worn at that time and that people wiped over. Also, the fact that we don't have a hadith about the fada'il, the virtues and the bounties of wiping over the socks. We simply have the permission, as this was something that they wore and the permission was given for them to wipe over it, shows that there's not لا يوجد جانب تعبدي إلا الاتباع في المسح على الخفين أو غيرهما مما هو مثلهما. There's no devotional aspect of wiping over the two khufs that has been transmitted or narrated, other than that the Prophet ﷺ did it and he permitted it. Other than that, there's no, if you wear khufs, you get this reward, right? So the sometimes fervent nature that people, or the I don't want to say zealous, but sometimes people are zealous about this, that you can only wipe over leather socks, is a misgiving. In the Hanbali madhab, as long as your footwear meets these 7 conditions, then they are permissible for you to wipe over. Now, the last condition here, which is they must not describe the skin underneath. Notice that the ulama of the madhab, they didn't say they must be thick or they must be thin. They gave an actionable regulatory principle. Why is that? Because there can be a conflation between that which is thick versus thin, that which is dense versus sheer. And they mention that the point of this is not that the footwear prevents water from getting in, but instead that it has a functional purpose for keeping the foot warm and protected, or keeping the foot protected from the elements. It does not mean that water cannot get through them, and that you cannot see the foot through them. So many times there's a conflation between a safaqa, right? The or thukhun, the idea of the, or samaka, those something being thick, and something being raqiq, being thin, versus something which is, or I should actually say, thakhin and raqiq, or samik and raqiq, for thick and thin, versus something which is safiq, dense, or kathif, tightly packed, gives an opaqueness, versus something which is sheer, shaffaf. Now, generally, previously, before modern production, Shaffaf was generally, something which was sheer, something which was thin would generally be sheer. Something which was thin would generally be sheer. Why? Because in order to produce something, there wasn't the idea of something being thin and dense. If it was dense, it was thick. Having something which was thin and dense and stayed on its own was far-fetched. But notice how the ulama of the madhab, they didn't account for the difference in production value. They said, what is the observable condition for the permissibility of wiping over them? وَعَدَمُ وَصْفِهِمَا الْبَشَرَةِ. They must not describe the skin underneath. Meaning that if they were thick and you could see the skin underneath, they would not be pure. And if they were thin and you could see the skin underneath, they would not be permissible. And if you were thin and you could see the skin underneath, they would not be permissible. So the density is not relative to the thickness or the thinness of the material. So that's a very important point, as a lot of people will talk about modern socks. And this is an unfortunate issue of lost in translation. Why? Because when modern produced socks kind of started appearing, and there was a insistence on a tashabbuh bil kuffar, of people imitating the disbelievers, many times there was a generalization that was unhealthy about, we have these traditional socks, but you're not allowed to wear those modern socks. Modern socks can mean a lot of different things, which is why the madhab does not tie this to any one culture, any one mode, any production value. It gives quantifiable conditions for permissibility of wiping over or not. Now notice as well that the author does not talk about the material that it's made from. In the shuruh, they'll say سواء من اللبود أو الجنود الجلود سواء من الجلود أو اللبود. The material can be from skin, tanned hide, tanned leather, or can be from textiles. Why did they allow that? Well, because there is more than 7, as Ibn al-Mundhir mentions, there are more than 7 of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam who wiped over what's known as al-jawrab, the sock. And we have this hadith from Mughira, although مختلف في صحته. There's some differences over the level of its authenticity. However, as Ibn Muflih said, that the differences that the scholars of hadith have about this hadith do not affect the ruling of it. The differences in the wording of the hadith do not affect the legal weight of the idea, especially since we have a large number of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een who are all doing this, wiping over their socks or their cloth or their textile footwear when these conditions were met. So this is something which is, excuse me, very important, right? Now, he then says, فيمسح للمقيم والعاصي بسفره من الحدث بعد اللبس أو بعد اللبس يوما وليلة والمسافر 3 أيام بلياليهن. The wiping is permissible, or wiping is permitted for a resident and for one sinfully traveling for a period of 1 day and 1 night after wearing them. Why is the author making why is the author lumping a person who is traveling for a sinful purpose along with the resident? The resident is allowed to do so for no express hardship that he's experiencing. He's simply allowed to wipe for 24 hours from the time that he breaks his wudu. If a person is traveling, they're generally allowed to do what? Join their prayers and shorten their prayers. And their wiping over their socks can extend to 3 days. The madhab says, however, that excuse me, because this person is traveling for sin, he is not rewarded with the same dispensations as a person who is traveling for a permissible or a simply unregulated purpose. Therefore, we don't reward and allow people to do more, have more time for sin because they are traveling. They are just like the person who was at home. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam أمر بالمسح على الخفين في غزوة تبوك 3 أيام ولياليهن للمسافر ويوما وليلة للمقيم. This is narrated by Ahmad in his Musnad. I think I mentioned this from the hadith of Auf ibn Malik. Starting from the occurrence of the minor ritual impurity, min al-hadath, right? He then says, for a traveler, the period is 3 days and 3 nights. If one begins wiping while traveling and then becomes a resident, or starts while a resident and then travels, or doubts the time or the starting time of wiping, the permissible duration defaults to that of the resident. Why is this? Because this is the yaqeen that we have certainty of. And everything beyond that is doubtful. As the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith about the person who was unsure about how many rak'ahs they had prayed, اطرح الشك ولتستبني على ما استيقنت أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم, leave off your doubt and build on that which you are sure of. He then says, ويجب مسح أكثر أعلى الخف ولا يجزئ مسح أسفله وعقبه ولا يسن. It is obligatory to wipe most of the upper part of the khuf, and wiping the bottom or heel is neither sufficient nor recommended. As it's narrated from Ali radiallahu anhu, لو كان الدين بالعقل, if our deen was established through rational devices, we would wipe the bottom of the khuf, but instead we wipe the top of it. Why? Because this is narrated from the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. لو كان الدين بالرأي أو لو كان الدين بالرأي لكان أسفل الخف أولى بالمسح من أعلاه وقد رأيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يمسح على ظاهر خفيه. This is narrated in the Sunan of Abi Dawud as well as Ad-Daraqutni, that Ali radiallahu anhu said, if this deen was per opinion, per rational devices, then the bottom of the khuf would be more becoming to be wiped than the top of it. But I saw the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wiping over the top of his khuf. He then says, وَمَتَى حَصَلَ مَا يُوجِبُ الْغُسْلِ أو ظهر بعض محل الفرض أو انقضت المدة بطل الوضوء. If something occurs that necessitates a full ritual bath, ghusl, if part of the area required to be washed becomes exposed, or if the wiping period expires, the ablution becomes invalid. Okay, so what this means is, I make wudu, I put my footwear on. Later on, let's say I put my footwear on at 12 o'clock. At 1:30, I break my wudu. I now have the dispensation to wipe over my socks or my footwear from 1:30 p.m. today to 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. If I get to 1:31 tomorrow, that means my wudu is broken. I can no longer continue to make regular wudu and wipe over the socks after 1:30 p.m. the next day, or 1:30 p.m. 3 days later. If I do something that necessitates that I make ghusl, if a woman starts her menses, or a man ejaculates, or something else is done that necessitates, or intercourse is had, whatever it may be, then you must take off your footwear and you must take a full ghusl. If you take off your footwear or part of it becomes exposed, then your wudu is broken and you must take the footwear off and make a complete wudu again. This is because of the hadith of صفوان بن عسال رضي الله عنه كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يأمرنا إذا كنا سفرا أن لا ننزع خفافنا 3 أيام ولياليهن إلا من جنابة. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when we were traveling, would order us to not remove our khufs for 3 days and nights, except because of janaba, except because of what necessitates ghusl. How do we know that if part of the foot becomes exposed, that it would break the ghusl? Because we know that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned to a man who was making wudu, and there was a glimmer of, or a spot on his foot that water had not reached, he ordered him to go and repeat his wudu. Therefore, a partial deficiency in wudu is like the entire wudu not being there, and therefore it is obligatory for you to go and continue your wudu. Okay. He then says, وَصَاحِبُ الْجَبِيرَةِ. Now this is another section. And this section is, similar to, it's essentially what is like the footwear that we're wiping off over. Okay, casts, splints, bandages, what do we do? He says, صَاحِبُ الْجَبِيرَةِ إِنْ وَضَعَهَا عَلَى طَهَارَةٍ لَمْ تَتَجَاوَزْ مَحَلَّ الْحَاجَةِ غَسَلَ الصَّحِيحَ وَمَسَحَ عَلَيْهِمَا وَبِالْمَاءِ وَأَجْزَأَ. The one with a splint, if he placed it while in a state of purification, and it does not exceed the area of necessity, washes the sound parts and wipes over it with water, and that's enough. Let me give you an example. If you had a cast, let's say, for example, you broke your wrist, and the doctor put your cast on from your hand all the way up to your elbow, okay? So you go from here to here. And it says this is medically necessary for your wrist to not move. Then what do? You wash your fingers. You wipe over the cast. You wash your elbow. If you do this and you had wudu when it was put on, you have no problem according to the madhab. Nothing else that you need to do. Other than that, there are two other situations that you need to look out for. Number one is if the cast was put on and you didn't have wudu or ghusl. Number two is if the cast was put on, but it goes beyond the required area. So let's talk about it going beyond the required area. So let's say you have your cast starting from here. You broke your wrist. Your doctor says, look, your wrist is broken and I could do a forearm cast, but I'm afraid that your arm won't be stable. So I'm going to give you a full arm cast up to your bicep so that your elbow stabilizes your forearm and your forearm stabilizes your wrist and you heal faster. So now, essentially, other than your fingers, your entire arm is covered. So here he says, if the splint was not applied in a state of purification and exceeds its required area, one washes the unaffected parts, your fingers, wipes over the splint, and then, out of precaution, performs tayammum. Okay? So first he says, if you have a splint and it's placed over a medically necessary area, wash the parts that are exposed, wipe over the splint, if you have wudu. If you don't have wudu, then your medically necessary area is covered. You wash the fingers, you wipe the cast, you wash the elbow, then you perform tayammum. If your splint or your cast was put on, was not applied in a state of purification, you did not have wudu, and it goes beyond the required area, then you would wash your fingers, wipe the cast, wash anything else, and then make tayammum. I think there's one situation that might be unclear. What if the doctor says it is medically necessary for you to have a full arm cast because this wrist is going to be stabilized by the elbow stabilized by the full arm cast? That's medically necessary, and you have wudu. Wash your fingertips, wipe over the rest. You're done. So if you have a cast put on while you have wudu, wash what's exposed, wipe over the cast. Doesn't matter how long the cast stays on, that's permitted. If you don't have wudu when the cast is put on, wipe over the exposed part. Wash the exposed part, wipe over the cast, and then make tayammum. Why? Because of the precaution taken in having a body part which is exposed. So this is the official madhab, and of course there are scholars who say otherwise. But we're studying Dalil al-Talib as the author mentions it. We're not going beyond that. We know this from the hadith of Sahib al-Shajja. A man was hit in his head during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ said, إنما كان يكفيه أو يكفي أن يتيمم ويعضد أو يعصب على جرحه خرقة ويمسح عليهما ويغسل سائر جسده. A man was hit in his head, and he was told that he had to bathe. And he was afraid that the bath would kill him. He died. The Prophet ﷺ told the people that had told him this, it would have been enough for him to make tayammum and then to wipe over, or to wrap over his wound a bandage, wipe over it, and then wash the rest of his body. Now, there is another narration from Ahmed that the situation that I described to you here of the official position of making wudu and wiping for part and then tayammum is not a necessity. That essentially, because لا يجمع بين العوض والمعوض أو بين البدل والمبدل منه, you generally do not combine two things, a source thing and then its replacement. You don't combine those two things. You either do the replacement like tayammum or you do wudu. Therefore, they say because tayammum is the replacement for wudu and not not done at the same time. And the hadith of the Sahib al-Shajja that we mentioned, that is narrated by Abu Dawood as well as al-Bayhaqi, that it's enough, in the second opinion, for a person to do one thing in all cases. Wash over what's exposed, wipe over the cast, and that's enough, regardless of whether he had wudu before or after. Now, there are a few things that the cast or the bandage or the splint differ with the khuf in. Number one is that there is no set time for the bandage or the cast to be on. Number two is that you have to wipe over the entirety of the bandage or the cast or the splint, not only just the part that covers the body part. Number three is that if you have a bandage or a cast or a splint and you must take a shower to make ghusl, then your ghusl is correct, because the ruling enters into ghusl and the ruling of the khuf does not enter into ghusl, or is not encompassed by ghusl. Number 4, that wearing it is a situation of necessity, and therefore necessity, الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. Necessities are gauged according to their extenuating circumstances. Number 5, أن المسح عليها عزيمة. The opposite of a rukhsa, a dispensation, is a obligation or a mandate. So wiping over your cast or your bandage or your splint is a medical mandate because of the situation that you're in, and therefore you must do that. It's not a choice whether or not to do that because you can't take it off. Number 5 or 6, that it is not obligatory that it cover the entirety of the area that you are generally expected to wipe or wash over in wudu or ghusl. And number 7 is that you do not wash the bandage or the splint or the cast, but you must wipe over it. Okay, that is bab al-mash ala al-khuffayn wal-jawrabayn. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to show you a few things, and let's go back here. Okay, and I want to okay, I hope that you can see this. I want to show you all because what I find is that sometimes, when we don't read these things in context, it becomes easy to make assumptions, as I said before, about what is permissible to wipe over. Now, all of the footwear that I'm going to show you are actually mentioned in the books of scholars. Books mentioned, especially in the books of the Hanbali scholars. So this is al-jawrab wal-na'al. As you can see, the jawrab is dense. It does not show the skin underneath, and it is somewhat being secured by the sandals. So let's remember the context that the people of Arabia lived in was not completely disconnected from the context of the ancient world. So when we look to Persia, we look to Rome, we look to Abyssinia, we find in their material history things that are extremely similar to what people were using at that time. Now, why would some scholars talk about the idea of wiping over the jawrab and the na'al versus the khuf? Well, because the norm of the Arabs was to wear khuf, and to wear jawrab, basically sandals and socks, was described by some scholars as adat al-aajim. It was the non-Arabs custom. But we find in the hadith of Mughira that the Prophet ﷺ did it. So it wasn't that odd. The point is that notice, here you have the footwear is covering everything that needs to be wiped. It's dense. It can be walked in, and he's wearing sandals with it. This is the khuf. Okay, this is the khuf. Most modern, and I tried to use this as it's a recreation of a ancient khuf, because most modern khufs have zippers on the sides. So the idea here is that there's general, difficulty in taking this off. This is al-hidha. This is the shoe. Okay. Now sometimes al-hidha is mentioned as a na'al, and sometimes it's as a leather shoe. The point being is that if a person is wearing this and it doesn't go over their ankle, they can't wipe over it. But if they have this on with socks, or this on with socks, or this on with a lafafa, which we'll see in a minute, then it would be permissible to wipe over. This is something called a nasif. So it's essentially like a like a half shoe, half muq or jawrab, or I'm sorry, half muq or hida. This is called al-lifaf. And essentially what people would do they would take they would take fabric and they would wrap it over the toes and then wrap it around the foot until it got to and then they would secure it with their sandals. Okay? And so is it permissible to wipe over or not? It is permissible, according to some scholars, to wipe over the lafafa as long as it meets the conditions, the 7 conditions that we gave for the wiping over the khuf. Okay? Al-muq, this is mentioned in the hadith. كان يمسح, the hadith of Bilal, رأيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يمسح على الموقين والخمار, narrated by Ahmed. I saw the Prophet ﷺ wiping over the 2 muqs. So it's a type of boot. Similar to this is al-jarmuq, wiping over al-jarmuq, which this is kind of like a low-level jarmuq you can see on the right, and usually a jarmuq was one that was high. Why did people wear thick leather footwear like this? Because this would be worn along with a type of clog, a type of wooden footwear, or inside of their suit, inside of their armor, so metal footwear that essentially needed protection and padding from the harshness of the footwear that they were wearing. There's another type of footwear that's mentioned, al-qibqab or al-ibab, until today, worn in Syria and bathrooms. This is an approximation of it. I think it looks a little bit different. But you'll find people, so essentially this is, would you be able to wipe over this if you were just wearing it on your feet? No, obviously you wouldn't, because it hardly covers anything. But it's mentioned in footwear. I wanted to give everyone a window into that. Okay, let's talk about other modern, there's that word again, footwear. Now, first, when we talk about what we're wearing based upon the cut, we're not talking about the material, just the cut. If you have half socks like this on the far upper left-hand corner, this is not permissible for you to wipe over, as it does not do what? It does not cover the area that you must cover. You must wash in wudu. Low-cut socks, or they call them footies or booties, those do not work as well. You cannot wear low-cut socks. What about ankle socks? If the ankle socks reach the middle of the ankle, then it is makruh to wipe over. If they reach above the ankle, if the ankle socks do not reach over the ankle, then they are not permissible to wipe over. I'm conflating another issue that has to do with this battle. If the ankle sock does not reach over the ankle, then it is not permissible to wipe over. Why? Because from the ankle below must be washed, and therefore your ankle socks have to cover your ankle completely. Other than that, crew socks, quarter socks, knee-high socks, over-the-knee socks, thigh-high socks, toe socks, as long as they cover completely your foot from the ankle below, including the ankle and below, then they are permissible. Okay, now let's talk about material. Material, if we look at cotton sport socks, the 7 conditions of wiping over footwear, according to the Hanbali madhab, are fulfilled here. They're secured by themselves. You can walk in them. They do not show the skin. They're permissible. They are pure. The conditions that have to do with material are fulfilled by cotton sports socks, as well as leather socks. What if you wanted to wear business socks? And the reason why I'm showing you guys these pictures along with names is that do not get caught up in semantics. No. Sheikh said business socks are not allowed. When the Sheikh was saying business socks, was he talking about this in his mind, or is he talking about this in his mind? Or is he talking about this in his mind? That's the thing. Names can change. What a person is thinking of in their mind can change. But would these business socks be permissible? They cover the obligatory spot, the spot that must be washed. They are they stay on by themselves. They can be walked in. They are pure. They are permissible. Yes, it would be permissible. Why? Because the idea of socks this thin being dense enough to cover the skin was not thought of in the past, or was not thought possible, but through production, things change. Now, this, on the other hand, besides being honestly, fashionably, and morally questionable, would not be permissible, because you can clearly see the skin. You can even see the hairs on this person's leg underneath. Sheer socks that are even worse, and I mean, there were some pictures that I found of sheer socks I didn't even put up here. I just thought they were muqrif. They were gross to look at. But if you're sheer socks, if you want to wear them as a fashion statement, sure, but they serve no purpose other than fashion. You certainly don't protect the foot inside the footwear. Certainly don't protect from heat or from cold. They certainly serve, and you can see the skin from underneath. Therefore, they are not permissible whatsoever. And with that, inshallah ta'ala, we conclude for the night. And I will see you all next week, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.